On the night of June 5, 1944, the world stood on the edge of its greatest turning point. While 5,000 Allied ships crossed the stormy English Channel, Adolf Hitler slept, unaware that the largest invasion in human history was already unfolding. As paratroopers dropped into the darkness and naval guns opened fire along the Normandy coast, the German High Command fell into confusion, fear, and disbelief. By the time Hitler finally awoke, precious hours had been lost, hours that would decide the fate of Europe. This is the story of how one man's hesitation helped seal the outcome of World War II. In the late hours of June 5, 1944, Europe lay suspended between two worlds, the one that had been shaped by nearly 5 years of war, and the one that would begin with a single dawn. As midnight approached, a massive Allied armada, 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and more than 150,000 soldiers moved steadily across the dark waters of the English Channel. It was the largest amphibious operation ever attempted in human history. Yet on the opposite side, in the German command structure, an unsettling quiet prevailed. In Normandy, the German defenses along the Atlantic Wall were incomplete, undermanned, and deeply fragmented. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the officer responsible for defending the French coast, had repeatedly warned Hitler that an Allied invasion was inevitable. But on that night, Rommel was not even in Normandy. Convinced that the poor weather made a landing impossible, he had traveled to Germany to visit his wife for her birthday and to argue for more resources. For Rommel, the storm clouds that swept across the Channel were a sign that the Allies would wait. For the Allies, the same weather offered the perfect cloak. Meanwhile, in southern England, General Eisenhower had already made the final, agonizing decision. The invasion would proceed. Meteorologists predicted a short window of slightly improved conditions, an extraordinary piece of fortune that the Germans, relying on their own limited weather stations, failed to foresee. Eisenhower's commanders briefed soldiers, gliders were prepared, paratroopers boarded planes, and naval convoys cut through churning waters. The scale of the operation remained unimaginable to the German command. In Hitler's inner circle, the mood on June 5th was far from alert. Intelligence failures and Allied deception operations, particularly Operation Fortitude, had successfully convinced the Nazi leadership that the true invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais, far from Normandy. The Allies fed this belief with fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and a phantom 1st U.S. Army group under General George Patton. Every clue reinforced the illusion. As a result, German commanders interpreted unusual Allied movements across England as preparation for an attack that, in their minds, would come weeks later and at a different location. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, staff officers followed routine procedures. Reports of Allied bombings, submarine movements, and reconnaissance flights flickered through. None seemed extraordinary. Hitler himself, exhausted from long hours and fueled by a sense of strategic overconfidence, had retired for the night. He believed he understood the enemy's intentions better than his generals did. He was so certain that the Allies would strike Calais that he ignored the possibility of Normandy entirely. Along the Atlantic Wall, German soldiers on duty saw signs but misinterpreted them. Radar stations detected an unusual increase in aircraft. Some coastal observers reported distant silhouettes on the water. A few officers filed warnings, but communication breakdowns, rigid hierarchies, and fear of contradicting higher command muted their impact. Most believed what they had been trained to believe. No invasion was possible under such weather, and certainly not in Normandy. As the clock passed midnight, thousands of Allied paratroopers leapt from C-47 aircraft into the darkness. The night sky over Normandy flickered with anti-aircraft fire. Paratroopers landed miles from their intended zones, scattered by wind, poor visibility, and chaotic conditions. but their presence alone shattered the German belief that nothing significant was happening. Villagers heard gunfire, German sentries exchanged confused radio messages, and still Hitler slept. By 2 a.m., German commanders in Normandy began to realize that these airborne drops were not small raids. Reports flooded in from Sainte-Mère-Église, Carentan, and the Cotentin Peninsula. Bridges were being seized, communications lines were being cut. Entire companies of German troops were pinned down by unseen forces. At 3 a.m., the Kriegsmarine reported an enormous radar signature approaching the Normandy coast. It was the Allied fleet. But with Hitler unreachable and the chain of command paralyzed by uncertainty, no major orders could be issued. The night deepened, and the enormity of the moment grew. Thousands of Allied soldiers waited in landing craft, waves crashing over their helmets. Battleships positioned themselves for bombardment. Pilots scanned their instruments, ready to deliver the first wave of support fire. The German coastal batteries, undersupplied and poorly coordinated, struggled to understand the incoming threat. Inside every Allied transport, a quiet prevailed, an anxious silence broken only by the hum of engines and whispered prayers. For many, this night would be the last they would ever know. For Europe, it was the last night under the illusion that Nazi control was unbreakable. The greatest invasion in history was underway, and yet the most powerful man in Germany, the man whose decisions would shape the fate of millions, remained unaware. Hitler slept soundly as the world changed forever. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as the Allied invasion force drew closer to the beaches of Normandy, the German High Command entered a state of growing alarm. Reports continued to pour in from scattered defensive posts along the French coastline. Paratroopers had landed in unexpected clusters across the Cotentin Peninsula. Bridges were under attack, communications lines were failing. But the most crucial link in the German chain of command, the only man empowered to release key armored divisions, remained unreachable. Adolf Hitler was still asleep. Inside the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the atmosphere shifted from routine efficiency to rising tension. Officers whispered to one another in corridors, uncertain of whether to wake the Führer. Hitler's personal staff had strict instructions never to disturb him unless absolutely necessary. Moreover, many of them feared his reaction if the threat turned out to be a false alarm. For over a year, Allied deception efforts, particularly Operation Fortitude, had conditioned German leaders to believe that any activity in Normandy would be nothing more than a diversion. The real invasion, they insisted, would strike at Pas-de-Calais. As dawn approached, the contradiction between belief and reality intensified. At 4 a.m., the first naval bombardments began pounding German positions along Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. Artillery officers in Normandy sent increasingly desperate signals to headquarters. They were under attack by overwhelming naval firepower. The scale was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. By 5 a.m., thousands of landing craft had begun to align themselves for the greatest amphibious assault in history. Still, Hitler slept. At 6 a.m., General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, received confirmation from multiple sources. The Allied fleet off Normandy was enormous, consisting of thousands of ships. In addition, Luftwaffe reconnaissance had detected no significant Allied troop concentrations opposite Pas-de-Calais. Everything pointed to one conclusion: the long-anticipated invasion was happening, and it was happening now. Even so, Jodl hesitated. Internal memos from the German High Command reveal a paralyzing fear of contradicting Hitler's strategic assumptions. For months, he had insisted that Normandy was not the primary target. As a result, the armored divisions Rommel had requested were positioned far inland, unable to counter the invasion in its earliest and most vulnerable moments. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief in the west, repeatedly urged that these panzer divisions be released immediately. Yet without Hitler's approval, nothing could move. By 7 a.m., German commanders in Normandy were reporting catastrophic developments. Hundreds of Allied bombers flew overhead in tight formations. Infantry divisions stormed multiple beaches simultaneously. German artillery units were being knocked out one by one, and still no orders from Hitler. It was not until around 10 a.m. that Hitler was finally awakened. General Jodl entered his room carrying maps and dispatches. Sleepy and irritable, Hitler listened as Jodl explained the situation. Allied forces had begun a major landing in Normandy, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft. A massive airborne operation had preceded it. The invasion was real, but Hitler refused to accept the evidence. For hours after waking, he insisted that the landings were a diversion, a trap designed to pull German forces away from Pas-de-Calais, where he believed the true invasion would occur. This belief, strengthened by the Allies' masterful deception campaign, dominated Hitler's thinking. His conviction was so strong that he dismissed the reports of his own commanders. Even as divisions of the US 1st and 4th Infantry fought their way off the beaches, even as Canadian and British forces advanced inland, even as Saint-Mère-Église became the first liberated town in France, Hitler maintained that the main blow was still to come elsewhere. Eyewitness accounts from the Wolf's Lair describe his reaction as a mix of irritation, skepticism, and growing frustration. He paced the room, demanded clarifications, and scolded his generals for presenting what he considered incomplete information. According to Albert Speer, Hitler repeatedly returned to the same question: where are the main Allied armies? In his view, the scale of the Normandy landings was too great, too bold to be genuine. He believed it was impossible for the Allies to risk so many troops unless they intended to strike at a more strategic location afterward. While Hitler debated, time slipped away. Field Marshal Rundstedt demanded immediate reinforcement. Rommel, rushing back from Germany, pleaded through intermediaries for the armored divisions to be deployed. Panzer-Lehr, the 21st Panzer Division, and several Waffen-SS units could have counterattacked early and potentially crushed some of the beachheads while they were still fragile. However, Hitler delayed releasing them for hours, waiting for confirmation that Pas-de-Calais remained quiet. By the time he finally began authorizing limited movements, the Allied foothold on the beaches had grown significantly stronger. The moment for a decisive counterattack, the moment the German strategy depended on, was gone. As morning turned to afternoon, the German High Command realized that the invasion Hitler had spent years preparing for had arrived, and that they had met it with hesitation and confusion rather than decisive action. The window of opportunity was closing, and for the first time, the balance of power in Western Europe was shifting irreversibly. As the morning of June 6, 1944 unfolded across Western Europe, the German military machine, once feared for its ruthless speed, began to show the consequences of indecision at its highest level. The early reports of the Allied landings, already hours old by the time Hitler awoke, were no longer isolated fragments of confused radio chatter. They had formed a clear, undeniable reality. The Allies had opened a massive front in Normandy, and yet, inside the rigid structure of German command, paralysis continued to dominate the day. One of the central pillars of German defensive doctrine was the swift use of armored divisions to throw any beach landing back into the sea. Rommel had argued forcefully that tanks must be positioned close to the coast, able to counterattack within minutes of an invasion. Rundstedt, though more cautious, agreed that armored units were essential for any hope of stopping the Allies. But Hitler had rejected both men's recommendations months earlier. Instead, he placed most panzer divisions under his personal authority, scattered miles inland, restricted by bureaucracy and awaiting direct orders that only he could give. This structure now proved disastrous. Shortly after 10 a.m., reports showed that the Allies had firmly landed across multiple beaches. Omaha Beach, though fiercely contested, was not collapsing. Utah Beach had been secured far more easily than the Germans expected. British and Canadian troops were advancing inland from Gold, Juno, and Sword, and though German infantry units fought with determination, they lacked numbers, mobility, and heavy equipment. The commanders closest to the situation, including General Marks of the 84th Corps and General Kreis of the 352nd Infantry Division, urgently requested armored support. But every request met the same obstacle. The panzer divisions required Hitler's explicit authorization to move. Rundstedt himself sent repeated messages asking for permission to launch a coordinated counterattack. He warned that every hour lost increased the strength of the Allied foothold. Hitler refused to act. Still convinced that the landing in Normandy was merely a feint, he instructed his chiefs that the main armored reserve must be protected for the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. Even as evidence accumulated, photographs, eyewitness accounts, naval bombardments, and massive airborne operations, Hitler resisted the shift in his worldview. His certainty, built on months of Allied deception, anchored him to a strategic fantasy. Meanwhile, Rommel raced back toward France after learning of the invasion. As he traveled, he received fragments of reports from his subordinates. Each message painted a clearer picture of the scale of the attack. Rommel understood that the window for a counterstrike was rapidly closing. His frustration grew as he realized that without immediate deployment of armored forces, the Atlantic Wall would crumble. But Hitler's decision-making remained unyielding. By midday, several German divisions, including the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, the Panzer Lehr Division, and the 2nd Panzer Division, sat idle, waiting for orders that never came. Their commanders grew increasingly desperate. They knew that tanks were the only units capable of smashing through freshly landed infantry before they could establish supply lines and defensive positions. But with Hitler withholding authorization, they could not move. Compounding the problem was the overwhelming Allied air superiority. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany, was all but absent from the skies over Normandy. Allied aircraft roamed freely, intercepting German convoys, destroying supply columns and strafing roads. Even units that attempted to move without permission faced catastrophic losses. Allied fighter bombers made daylight travel almost impossible. The German commanders understood the stakes. Rundstedt famously urged Hitler, "Make peace, you fools." It was not a plea of defeatism, but an acknowledgement of the strategic disaster unfolding. Hitler dismissed him. At 1 p.m., Hitler convened a situation conference. He listened as Jodl and Keitel summarized the extensive evidence proving the invasion's magnitude. He remained unmoved. If anything, the confirmation pushed him deeper into denial. Hitler insisted that once the Allies committed their main army at Pas-de-Calais, he would use his armored divisions to crush them decisively. He argued that the Normandy landings would collapse on their own, but the situation on the ground continued to deteriorate. By afternoon, Allied engineers had cleared beach obstacles, established functioning beachheads, and begun landing tanks, artillery, and vehicles. What had been vulnerable infantry waves in the early morning had now transformed into powerful, structured forces capable of pushing inland. Only at 3 p.m. did Hitler finally authorize the release of the panzer divisions. The delay, more than 5 hours after he was first informed, proved fatal. By this time, the Allies had secured enough ground, supplies, and reinforcements to withstand any counterattack. The opportunity had passed. When the first German armored units finally moved, they were immediately targeted by Allied aircraft. Convoys were destroyed, fuel trucks exploded, and entire roads became scenes of devastation. Only the 21st Panzer Division, which had been granted partial autonomy earlier in the day, managed to launch a limited and isolated counterattack near Sword Beach, but without broader support, it achieved little. The momentum of the invasion was now unstoppable. The decisions made or not made inside Hitler's command center that morning changed the course of history. The delay had cost not just hours, but the destiny of Western Europe. By the late afternoon of June 6, 1944, the German High Command found itself grappling with a crisis it had never fully prepared for. The Atlantic Wall, supposedly impregnable, was collapsing segment by segment. The Allies had not only survived the initial landings, but had expanded their beachheads into firm, interconnected positions. And yet, the German response remained fragmented, confused, and crippled by internal disagreements and the harsh realities of the battlefield. Inside the Wolf's Lair, an atmosphere of rising panic permeated the conference rooms. The German officer corps, trained to execute orders with precision and speed, now faced the consequences of decisions that had been delayed for hours. Although Hitler had finally authorized the movement of armored divisions earlier that afternoon, his orders came far too late to change the situation on the ground. The Allies had turned the beaches of Normandy into fortified entry points, protected by naval artillery, fresh reinforcements, and overwhelming air superiority. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, experienced and pragmatic, recognized the gravity of the situation immediately. He urged a full, organized withdrawal to more defensible positions inland. His reasoning was simple. Without air support and without the element of surprise, armored divisions could not effectively counterattack. But Hitler rejected any suggestion of retreat. For him, the idea of giving ground was intolerable. The Atlantic Wall, he insisted, must be held at any cost. General Alfred Jodl and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's closest military advisors, struggled to reconcile the worsening reports from Normandy with Hitler's ever-shifting demands. Reports showed that the Allies were landing thousands of additional troops every hour. Tanks were rolling onto the beaches. Engineers had erected artificial harbors, mulberries, capable of unloading massive quantities of supplies. And yet, Hitler continued to insist that this still might not be the main invasion. Meanwhile, the German commanders on the ground were trying desperately to impose order on a battlefield that was spiraling out of control. The 21st Panzer Division, one of the few panzer units near enough to take action early on, had launched an afternoon counterattack between Sword and Juno beaches. It achieved brief local success, pushing toward the coast and causing temporary disruption. But the moment momentum began to grow, the offensive stalled. Lacking support from additional armored divisions, the 21st Panzer could not hold its gains. The Allies quickly regrouped, redirected naval fire, and forced the Germans to withdraw. Elsewhere, armored units attempting to reach Normandy faced relentless danger. The skies over northern France were dominated by Allied aircraft. Fighter bombers patrolled roads, railways, and rivers, attacking any German vehicle that dared to move in daylight. Entire convoys were destroyed before reaching the front. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed largely of young, fiercely indoctrinated soldiers, tried to reach the coastal area, but came under such heavy air attack that movement slowed to a crawl. Panzer Lehr, one of the best-equipped armored divisions in the entire German army, suffered similar losses. For German commanders, the reality was clear. Even if tanks reached Normandy, they would arrive piecemeal, exhausted, and without the ability to coordinate a decisive blow. Inside the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's frustration grew into outright fury. He demanded to know why the Luftwaffe was not attacking Allied ships and aircraft. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, could provide no meaningful answer. Years of attrition on the Eastern Front, Allied bombings of aircraft factories, and fuel shortages had left the Luftwaffe a shadow of its former self. On D-Day, it managed only a handful of sorties over the beaches, far too few to influence the outcome. The senior officers watched as Hitler's mood shifted wildly. At moments, he insisted that they must prepare for a massive counterattack. Minutes later, he demanded confirmation that Normandy was only a decoy. His orders became contradictory, his focus unstable. The system that depended on his absolute control had now become its own greatest weakness. By evening, it was evident that the Allies had not only gained a foothold, but were beginning to expand deeper inland. British and Canadian units advanced toward Caen. US forces from Utah Beach moved rapidly across the Cottontown Peninsula. Even the hard-fought Omaha Beach, which nearly descended into disaster for the Americans, had stabilized into a functional landing zone. The German infantry, though disciplined and determined, was outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated. Hitler convened another evening meeting, this time acknowledging, though reluctantly, that the landings in Normandy were genuine. Yet instead of authorizing a full-scale withdrawal to reorganize defenses, he ordered a fight-to-the-last-man defense of the coast. This decision only further weakened the German position. Units that could have regrouped inland to form coherent defensive lines were instead sacrificed in small, isolated pockets along the beaches. The German army had lost the initiative and would never regain it. The chaos of June 6th, driven by delayed decisions, lack of coordination, and the complete collapse of air superiority, marked the beginning of a long, inevitable retreat from Western Europe. As night fell on June 6, 1944, the landscape of Normandy bore the unmistakable signs of the day's extraordinary violence. The beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were now firmly in Allied hands. Smoke rose from destroyed fortifications, burned-out vehicles, and shattered coastal batteries. The thunder of artillery echoed across distant fields as newly arrived Allied units continued to push inland. For the German High Command, the realization began to settle. The invasion had succeeded, and for Adolf Hitler, it was a moment that marked a deeper and more personal defeat. Inside the Wolf's lair, the tone of discussion shifted from denial to grim acceptance. The reports were unambiguous. By the end of D-Day, more than 156,000 Allied troops had landed in France. Over 20,000 vehicles, including tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, were already ashore. The Mulberry Harbour off the British beaches was being assembled with astonishing speed. Engineers and logistics officers were turning the beaches into supply hubs with a level of efficiency that stunned German intelligence. For the first time, Hitler acknowledged that Normandy was not a diversion. He listened as General Jodl detailed the enormity of the Allied operation, the coordination of naval gunfire, the precision of airborne drops, and the relentless dominance of Allied aircraft. Hitler's expression hardened. According to later accounts from Albert Speer and General Nicholas von Below, the room fell into a silence marked by an unusual heaviness. Hitler understood what the numbers meant. The carefully constructed Atlantic Wall, a symbol of Nazi invincibility, had not just been breached, it had been rendered irrelevant in a single day. In Normandy, the situation worsened for the Germans with every passing hour. Units defending the beaches were reduced to fragments. Some battalions suffered over 60% casualties. Others were completely cut off or forced to surrender. Ammunition was running low, communications were unreliable, and morale, once considered one of the Wehrmacht's strongest assets, had begun to fracture. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and later Rommel, who arrived back in France on June 7th, pressed for a strategic withdrawal. Their argument was simple. The Allies were now too strong to be pushed back. The only hope lay in consolidating forces further inland, protecting supply lines and preparing for prolonged defensive warfare. Rundstedt stated plainly that the situation was beyond recovery without massive reinforcements that Germany no longer possessed. Hitler rejected their advice. His response reflected a pattern that had accelerated in the final years of the war, an absolute refusal to concede ground, no matter how tactically necessary. Instead of authorizing a withdrawal, Hitler ordered that all positions in Normandy be held to the last man. He demanded that counterattacks be prepared immediately, despite the fact that German units lacked the fuel, manpower and air cover necessary to launch them. From the German perspective, Hitler's orders were impossible. Panzer divisions had been shattered en route by Allied aircraft. Infantry units moved only at night to avoid detection. Supply convoys were destroyed with such regularity that even basic logistical operations became nearly impossible. By nightfall, Allied fighter bombers had turned the road network of northern France into a graveyard of destroyed vehicles. Meanwhile, the Allies pressed every advantage. Naval artillery protected the beaches. Fresh troops continued to arrive without interruption. The Canadians moved toward Pas-de-Calais. The British pushed toward Caen. American forces at Utah Beach advanced efficiently inland, establishing contact with paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Even Omaha Beach, scene of some of the bloodiest fighting of the day, was transformed from a near disaster into a functioning supply zone. Late that night, Hitler convened another conference. The cables arriving on his desk painted a bleak picture. German forces were exhausted, disorganized, and increasingly isolated. No Luftwaffe intervention could be expected. No reinforcements could arrive in time to reverse the situation. Yet Hitler insisted that the Wehrmacht launch a major counteroffensive the next morning. His generals, aware of the impossibility of this demand, exchanged uneasy glances. They would try, but they knew the outcome already. The German army had lost the most crucial battle of the Western Front before the second day had even begun. In the quiet hours that followed, Hitler retreated to his private study. Accounts from his staff describe him as withdrawn, rigid, and unusually silent. The man who once believed he could dictate the future of Europe now faced the consequences of his own strategic miscalculations. The Allied landings in Normandy were not just a military operation. They were the beginning of the end. Within 10 months, Hitler's empire would collapse, Berlin would fall, and the war in Europe would end. But the turning point, the moment when Germany's defeat became irreversible, occurred on that first day, June 6, 1944. The day Hitler hesitated. The day the Allies returned to the continent. The day the world changed.